Hey all, hope all's well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 6 game from the Chicago Open. Now, if you followed the round 5 video, you know that I drew a relatively long and tough game against FIDE Master Seth Homa, and I was pretty much just hoping to rebound from that one because I had the win within my grasp, but let it slip at the last moment when I was trying to convert in a rook endgame. In this one, my opponent was another FIDE Master, around 2,300 strength, by the name of David Peng. And I'd not heard of this player before, but apparently he's just another young and up-and-coming American player. There are a lot of those these days. You know, born in 2003, so I'm almost like a senior citizen on the circuit now, being 10 years older, right? I'm born in 93. So, yeah, no easy games, and there's a lot of young talent. So I was just trying to stay focused in this one and just recover with black. So without further ado, let's get into it. So David opened with e4, and I decided to play for the Caro-Kann with c6, d4, d5. And frankly, I had no idea which line of the Caro he played. One of the problems in a lot of American Open tournaments is you actually don't get the pairings until literally 5 minutes before the round. So unless you're there with your book bag and your laptop or whatever, it's pretty much impossible to really get any meaningful preparation done. So you kind of just have to roll with the punches of whoever you're playing. And he played e takes d5, and I was immediately surprised because I didn't know, you know, what type of Caro-Kann line he played, or even whether he was an e4 or d4 player, frankly. So anyways, after e takes d5, c takes d5, bishop d3, this is kind of the start of the exchange variation, and the question really is, what am I going to do with my pieces? Now, there's one strategy where you play the knight to f6, this knight to c6, and go bishop g4. There's a line where you can fianchetto the bishop. There's also this really bad line that I played at the St. Louis Norm Invitational in the last round where I went knight f6, e6, and bishop d7, and that was extremely tepid. And in this one, I decided to play a little bit more actively and went for the move knight c6. And after c3, I went for g6. And this is highly, highly unusual, this move order. In fact, we actually have a completely fresh position in just two more moves. And so keep in mind this idea because it's extremely, extremely unique. So after g6, white went bishop f4, and this move is relatively normal. The point is that you get this bishop on this long diagonal, and you also rob my queen of that square. A lot of the times the black queen likes to go to c7 and take that diagonal, and for that reason, there's a line where after queen c7, white actually goes knight e2 to challenge this queen on the f4 square. But with g6, I had a very specific idea in mind, and the idea was that after bishop f4, I wasn't going to, obviously go queen c7, but I was delaying my knight to go to the f6 square because I was playing bishop h6. And this was kind of the interesting idea, was that I'm challenging the bishop on this diagonal, and, you can retreat the bishop, but then you might be losing a tempo playing bishop g3, and I managed to develop one of my pieces. And so if you did go bishop g3, now I might consider knight f6, and I got a little tempo for my bishop h6 move, and there is the potential to consider knight h5 in a moment, hitting this bishop on g3 and getting the bishop pair, or jumping over to f4. So, for instance, let's say white went knight f3. Now knight h5 is quite a serious move, and I'm hitting the g3 bishop, and maybe if bishop h4, maybe I consider going knight f4. I don't know. Hitting this bishop on d3 and this pawn on g2. And who knows, maybe bishop f1 is the best move here, undeveloping, just to preserve both pieces. But in any case, you can see that bishop h6 is a very, very unique move that kind of mixes it up. So actually, this position had been played a few times before with queen d2, I saw in the database. And there are some games with bishop takes f4 and queen takes f4. But in this position, white actually went for knight e2, and I believe here this was already a new position, which is extremely rare that you have a new position on move 7. So very, very exciting to get something that's fresh, that hasn't been played before. It's, kind of what any chess player should strive for. Well, maybe not every chess player, but it's something that I relish, playing positions that, where you actually have to think on your own and be a little bit creative, because that's when like kind of the art and creativity of chess comes into the fold, and I enjoy that element of the game. So anyways, after knight e2, I have a choice, because white is deciding to keep the tension. And the choice is, should I take on f4, or should I keep the tension myself? And, given, this little bit of creativity, I didn't want to just take on f4 and kind of resolve the tension, even though that was a totally reasonable move. I could take on f4 and then go knight f6, and then I'll castle and we'll have a relatively normal game. But instead, I wanted to kind of push the envelope a little bit more, and I went for the move bishop f5. And the idea with this was quite concrete. The point was that if the bishop takes on f5, after g takes f5, I thought I had a nice control over the center, and I thought my double pawns wouldn't be such a big issue. So I'd seen this type of structure with g takes f5 in some lines of the Dutch, and well, there's some Dutch type positions where white is actually playing on the white side of the Dutch, playing against a stone wall, and gets the kind of double f pawns and a great clamp on the e4 square. So I thought that, maybe I can get some version of that structure that I'd seen before. And also, I've also seen it in some d4 openings. In fact, in the Schlechter Slav, white actually develops the bishop to e2 instead of d3 because of this bishop f5 trick. So if you saw the game that I played, terrible game against Pavlo Vorontsov a few rounds ago in this tournament, you'd actually know that this is actually bishop f5 sometimes can be a thing if they go bishop d3. And in that game against Pavlo, he went bishop e2, but just keeping that in mind. Anyway, so David took up the challenge and went bishop takes f5. And after g takes f5, well, it's obviously a very unique structure, and white opted to play knight d2, just continuing to develop and keep the tension. Another option that I thought maybe was a little bit more testing was the move bishop takes h6. Point being that after knight takes h6 and queen d2, my knight is a little bit awkwardly placed on h6, and maybe the queen could cause some trouble on the king side, since I'm not totally secure here just yet. I'd probably have to play a move like queen d6 to shore up this knight on h6, because I thought a move like knight g8 might be a little bit too awkward, and I didn't love knight g4 because I thought he could just kick me away with h3 eventually. So yeah, I mean, it's a little bit unclear. I mean, if the thing is that queen g5 right now is not devastating for me because I do have e6, and the point is that I'm happy trading the queens with this clamp in the middle. And if the queen comes to g7, I do have queen f6, which forces off the trade of queens. So it's not like I'm in chronic danger on the king side. I just thought queen e2 is a little bit more testing and a little bit more concrete. Anyways, after knight d2, I went for e6, just establishing this type of bind that I was talking about. And white castled, but again, I think bishop takes h6 would make some sense. Again, getting my knight away from the square that it wants to go to, which is probably e4. Like, my knight would love to be an anchor on that square. And so by making me capture on h6, it's a little bit far from the action there. So after e6, white castled, and now I was like, you know what? I do want my knight on e4. I'm going to release the tension now and take on f4. And after bishop takes f4, knight takes f4, I had a very, very interesting decision to make, because it would appear that white is seriously ahead in development. So the only thing that I kind of have going for me is my, sort of my pawns in the center and my control in the middle. But I kind of have to decide here, how am I going to play? Is my king going to go king side? Is it going to go queen side? Is it going to stay in the middle? How am I going to deal with these knights jumping around in the middle of the board potentially? And also, I mean, white's almost nearly has the rooks connected, and I don't. I need a few moves, right? Because my rooks still have a lot of things in the way before they get connected. So I do have to be relatively decisive about what I'm trying to do here. Now, there were many options. One option actually was to continue to make strange-looking moves and go h5. And the point is, with h5, I actually take away the square from the knight and the queen, and so I gain space on that side of the board. And yeah, there's actually no real decent way to kind of invade in my camp just yet. So black is actually pretty fine here. The line can continue rook e1, knight f6, knight f3, queen c7, and yeah, black doesn't have any serious problems here. You might say, well, isn't this e5 square something that's kind of juicy for a white knight? Yes, it is, but I would trade a pair of knights, and then my knight can also jump into e4, so it's not a huge problem. Another way I could have played was to go queen c7 and challenge this knight on f4 right away and think about castling queenside. Now, this line is a little bit of a remix on the h5 line, because in this variation, the knight can actually go to h5. And that's why it could be critical to actually put the pawn on h5 myself, so it doesn't have this option to kind of stifle my king side a little bit. But even here, I can castle queen e2, knight g7, and black has, pretty good position here. I mean, I'm controlling e5 pretty well with my queen and my knight. This knight might spin around to g6. And this knight on h5 is a little bit annoying because it prevents me from taking more space on the king side and getting my initiative going. But I would eventually be able to challenge it with like rook g8 and rook g5. So it's not like it's permanently secure there. And this would be another position relatively close to equality. But instead of those choices, actually, I elected to just play knight f6, which was kind of my thought process all along, was that instead of, having the knight come out to h6 to, support that bishop, I wanted it to kind of be, very quickly be able to get to e4, because I didn't want a rook bearing down on the e6 pawn for too long. So I wanted a knight to be able to jump into e4 as needed. So after knight f6, knight f3 was played. I think this makes a lot of sense, trying to take advantage of an potential outpost for the pieces. And now I went queen c7, challenging the knight on f4, and white went knight d3, again challenging for this outpost. And here I actually decide to play knight e4, actually just coming into this square right away, and I thought, I'm going to castle queenside and really have quite an active position. And my double pawns seem to be more of an asset than a strength right now, because it means I, again, have great control of the center and also the half-open G file to work with. And, white doesn't have any really good pawn breaks at the moment, because if you play c4, you're just weakening the d pawn. So, and it just becomes isolated. So I thought, my king would probably be secure on the queen side. So after knight e4, white decided to take the plunge with one of the knights, and I thought it made sense to actually trade one of these knights, because I didn't love both of these knights just sitting here forever, and I also didn't like the prospect of, if I castled a move like knight takes c6, because if I take with the b pawn, now my king side is less secure with these pawns being split, and if I take with the queen, then the knight just comes in with tempo. So because I didn't want to allow that, I actually opted to take on e5 first, which seemed logical to me. And I think here my opponent made a mistake that a kind of critical mistake in my opinion, and played the move d takes e5, which is a very, very weird and strategically risky recapture. Why is that, you may ask? Well, part of the reason for that is normally when you have a square that you're trying to occupy or control, or a square that you're trying to really take advantage of, it's actually better to control it from afar than to occupy it with a pawn. And so what I mean by that is, once d takes e5 is played, the square is no longer a problem issue for me, because it's not like a knight can occupy it anymore. It's no longer a potential outpost. So here, after d takes e5, this knight doesn't have that anchor in the center of the board that it would have had otherwise. The other thing is that, there was pressure potentially on the e file, and now with the pawn on e5, it's like my pawns are even more secure than they were before. And so those kind of dynamics, I think, are very, very important. Last but not least, the e5 pawn might actually be a target in the endgame, because now in order for this pawn to be, supported, f4 would have to be played, and f4 is a move that would just further weaken white's king. So really in the middle game and potentially even in the end game, this pawn might be a liability more than it is a strength or something that really cripples my position. So I was thrilled to see d takes e5 because I thought it just missed the mark a little bit. Instead, after knight takes e5, castles, and queen h5, I think white more than holds the balance because, I'm pretty much obliged to make a move like knight d6 to protect f7, and you can see this knight is in an active position here. It can't really be challenged. Excuse me, it can't really be challenged anytime soon because if I go f6, I weaken my e6 pawn and the whole chain. So I would have to be a little bit patient playing around this active knight, and yeah, white would have a reasonable position here, and so would black, but just more active position than in the game for white. So anyways, after d takes e5, I castled, and I thought, again, I had a much better version of the position that would have happened after knight takes e5, because now f7 is not really a problem for me in the short term. And this knight doesn't have a really great outpost, where you can see my knight on e4 has a monster outpost supported by these awesome f5 and d5 pawns. So after castles, white actually went queen a4, and I actually believe this is another mistake, but I actually didn't take advantage of it in the best way. You do want to connect rooks. Connecting rooks is logical, so it is good that he moved the queen, but moving the queen away from the king side was not particularly advisable because beyond attacking this pawn on a7, there aren't really any credible prospects on this side of the board right now, and so it would have been a lot better to play a move like queen e2 or even queen h5, just keeping an eye on my queenside pawns and on the king side and the king side pawns and the king side in general. Instead, queen a4 actually allows a move that I missed, but is actually very, very key, and it's the move queen c4. And the problem with this is that white is actually not really ready to trade queens here, and the problem is that the knight is also on d3 is also attacked. So just to illustrate why white's not ready to trade queens here, if you take on c4, after d takes e4, I'm the one that's, first to the d file, and when the knight moves, I infiltrate with rook d2, and this position is already nearly decisive because my rook is on the second rank, I can bring the other rook over to d8, my knight's on a lovely outpost, and this is just a huge, huge problem for white. Also, queen takes a7, wins a pawn, but that's all it wins because after queen takes d3, you lose a piece, and there's really only a few checks. I mean, after queen a8, king c7, and queen a5, I think I can go king b8, and there are no more checks here, and that would be, a huge problem for white, just down a piece. So you can't grab the a7 pawn anymore. So believe it or not, in this position after queen c4, the computer wants white to actually go back to d1, which I think just illustrates why queen a4 isn't a good move. Now I could take space with h5 and get my own game going just fine. Instead, after queen a4, I think I was just a little bit too wary of the a7 pawn being hanging, and I think it was one of those moves where I didn't stop and think too long and just kind of made the automatic move because I have a pawn that's attacked. And that's something that you sometimes do when you're losing some focus, and you want to just kind of scan the board and see if there are any opportunities before you make a move automatically. But I'm pretty sure I just made this move king b8 very automatically to protect the a7 pawn, because frankly, king b8 was a move I was going to make anyway in the next few moves, because I wanted to tuck my king over away from the c file and just make sure that these pawns were protected. But the move king b8 missed the mark a little bit because it allowed the white queen to reposition itself on a really nice square, which is queen d4. And you can see from d4, not only is white supporting the king side, covering the e5 pawn, and also eyeing a7. It's just really, really well centralized, and it also controls the d4 square, because I might have considered playing a d4 break in the near future. So just not allowing the queen to get to d4 with queen c4 would have been huge, and it was a bit of a missed opportunity that I allowed this, because now all of a sudden my knight on e4 can't go to c5 if it wants to after its challenge. It has to go somewhere else. So anyways, after queen d4, I actually went rook c8. And my point was to actually give this knight on e4 a square on c5 if needed, if it needed to be kicked, because I was reluctant to put it on g5. It looked like a very awkward square there. For instance, if f3, knight g5, h4, it's trapped. So I didn't want to do that. And I was not so sure of the consequences of a knight coming to d2. Of course, I mean, of course I have the c4 square I can go back to, but I thought it would be nice, if possible, to just go to c5 and just keep that option open. So that's why I went rook c8. And in addition to that, I wanted to make this queen on d4 a little bit uncomfortable. So in some future, I thought maybe the rook can come to c4 and challenge that queen on d4. So anyways, after rook c8, white played rook a d1. I think this makes some sense, getting the rook towards the center. I mean, it's a little bit clinky because you don't see the d-file opening up at the moment, but maybe the knight moves somewhere, the queen moves, and the c-pawn maybe goes forward. I'm not so sure. After rook a d1, I played queen e7 now, trying to kind of execute that plan, which is teasing out the move rook c4. Not something I'm necessarily going to rush with, but something I was going to entertain. And also now eyeing the king side, right? Maybe my queen comes to g5 or h4 at some point. So after queen e7, white went queen e3. I think this is actually a really good move. And I think this actually kind of shows the point behind rook d1, is that now perhaps the d4 square will be cleared for the rook. And maybe there's going to be a rook transfer along the fourth rank. Because now that there's only really one half-open file that white can utilize, and it's the D file. For the near foreseeable future, the F file and the E file are going to be shut down with all these pawns on it. So the D file really is the highway through which white's rooks can really activate, whereas my rooks already have potential places to activate. So smart move, this queen E3. Now I decide to actually play H5, and my idea here was to just take more space on the king side. There were certain circumstances where I didn't like this queen darting out to H6 and stymieing my H5 pawn. And just like earlier in the game when we talked about playing H5 so that a knight couldn't launch there, H5 just gives this rook more space on the H file, and also might initiate some type of incursion on the white king side in the future. So makes a lot of sense. So after H5, white actually did go knight F4, and I felt really justified now because I played H5 before knight H5 sighting could happen. And so after knight F4, I decided to play H4. And again, my point was just to take more space here, almost in the vein of AlphaZero, the chess-playing computer that loves to move the rook pawns to take space on to take space on either flank. And this H pawn isn't necessarily going to, it may not do the most damage in the world, but it's definitely going to be an important potential distraction that can, maybe force out a weakness in white's camp. Because, at some point, if I get this H3 move in, it becomes a thorn pawn and a pawn that facilitates mating ideas. And if white actually plays H3, then the G3 square is a little bit sensitive, and you're more reluctant to play F3 now because my knight can dart into that square on G3. So when you push these rook pawns sometimes up the board, you just kind of force weaknesses that can be kind of valuable. So stay tuned there. So after H4, white went rook D4, continuing with his own plan of, activating his rooks via the fourth rank. And now I went for the move queen c7, but this was actually a mistake that should have allowed white an opportunity to pretty much equalize. Now my idea with this move was to kind of just target the e5 pawn and maybe cause white some consternation. But the issue here is that I'm actually not threatening that pawn, because if I take on e5, then white has f3, and my knight on e4 is pinned. So I'm actually not threatening to take the pawn. And so actually a much better move would have been the move knight c5. And the reason for this is that it kind of anticipates white's move in the game, which is c4. And the point is, now after d takes e4, rook takes e4, and knight d7, my queen is not on c7 where it's kind of in the way of the position, and my knight would be pinned from c5 like before. What happened in the game is that after I went queen c7, f3 was played, which I actually missed, kicking my knight away from c5, and now the move that should have been played but was not played could have been c4. And the issue is here at this very, very precise moment, white has multiple attackers on d5, which makes this incredibly annoying to defend, so I can't really do that. And so I'm obliged to kind of take on c4, but after rook takes c4, this pin is extremely, extremely annoying. And the problem is now, all of a sudden, white has both the d file and the c file for the rooks to kind of activate, which was not the case a few moves ago. So essentially, in this position, I'm pretty much obliged to move my queen because b4 is a serious threat, winning a piece. And after queen b6, white can continue to gang up on the c file with rook fc1, and this gives white more than enough activity to kind of force some exchanges and equalize the game. Again, b4 is kind of a threat, so I would probably go knight d7 just to deal with that. Well, actually, b4 is not even a threat. My knight's actually hanging here, right? There are 3 attackers on it. So I'm pretty much obliged to move it. And then after all of these exchanges, the position is relatively close to equal. I would try to keep the knights on the board just to keep it interesting, because if I trade the rooks, then it might be a little bit dangerous for me. Now that I've actually pushed the h-pawn super far and my pawns are doubled, I am a little weaker on the king side. And there's a nice little trick here, by the way, for you endgame aficionados out there that can actually create a passed pawn for white. And it's the move g3. And the point is that after h takes g3, you don't recapture, but you play h4. And all of a sudden, this position would be very, very dangerous for me with this pawn, kind of being a runner. Now, it's something that I could hold with very precise moves, bringing the knight over and then the king over. And the computer evaluates a line like this as equal, but not necessarily a position I'd want to play, frankly. So instead of this kind of wild line where we trade everything, and I would probably keep the one pair of rooks on the board just so the h-pawn is not as much of a liability. But even here, white can now play to invade on d7, and I think a repetition would be a likely result here, which is certainly not something I'd want playing someone that's just under 2,300 FIDE. So, yeah, that was certainly an opportunity for white that was missed, playing this c4 move, and really, it's all because I put my queen in the way of this on the c file, which would kind of unfortunately pin myself on the c file. So instead, after knight c5, white actually played rook e1, and I was thrilled because I'd recognized during the game that c4 was a strong move, and very quickly played knight d7, darting the knight back so that now c4 is firmly under my control. Of course, now c4 is out of the question because I can just recapture, and my knight can, reinforce on b6 if needed, and I would just be a pawn up here. Or, I guess in the line I just showed, I can actually take on e5 as well. So, after knight d7, white had to shift gears and try to play for something else. And he has made some gains with this rook, on the 4th rank now. But the issue, again, is that this knight doesn't have a great outpost on f4. And this e5 pawn is a target. And I've managed to encroach on the king side with my h-pawn. So, I think black still has the better practical chances and is honestly slightly better. So after knight d7, white went for knight d3, and this is actually a serious, serious mistake. Now, I understand why he did this. He maybe wanted to free the rook to eye the h4 pawn. I'm not sure where this knight was going, but I do understand opening this the rank for the rook. A better way to do that would have been knight h3. And we can see why, and with the next move, why this difference is kind of important. And the reason it's important is because I actually played the move h3. And h3 is a big time move, and pretty much all I could have dreamed of when I started with the move h5 is to kind of encroach on the white position and kind of create weaknesses in his camp that would make the king very uncomfortable. And somehow, some way, this pawn managed to get to h3 unscathed. And the issue here is if you play g takes h3, your king side is shattered, and, of course I'm going to invade on the h file. And if you push the pawn as he winds up doing, I have this thorn pawn that, is definitely a huge problem for the white king and makes it infinitely less safe. So actually, already after h3, it's actually quite a critical position because white needs to kind of figure out how I'm going to deal with this move. And, I think most people would actually go for the move that David played, which is g3, just kind of pushing the pawn, getting it away from h3. But believe it or not, the strongest move in this position is actually g4. And the reason for this is because, believe it or not, after an exchange on g4, even though this king is considerably weaker because of the h3 pawn here, my f7 pawn is a little bit loose. And so the point is that, no matter what, if I'm going to have this pawn on h3, you still want to have active files for your rooks. And by playing g4, you give your rooks counterplay on the weak pawn in my chain, which is f7. So the line could continue something like rook h7, rook f1, rook g8, and rook f3. And you can just see from these types of lines that white is getting counterplay on h3 and potential counterplay on the f7 pawn. And it gives white enough counterplay to kind of challenge black and not make it just a very easy task. In fact, the computer was giving lines close to equality, even though I think practically speaking, this would be a very difficult type of position for white to play because the white king is considerably weaker than the black king. So even though black is a pawn down, this would still be very dangerous. But I hope you got the point that g4 actually gives white more activity than g3 because all of a sudden the rook on e1 and can actually get into the game, which is not the case after g3. So after g3, I was like, okay, if this position opens up in any way and my pawn gets to stay on h3, I'm going to deliver mate because this whole second rank is weak. There also might be back rank problems. And so I really just need to get and try and open the position in some way. And so I started on that with the move knight b6. And this is the first of a series of very strong moves that I make that really kind of pry open the position in a probing way. Essentially, I'm probing white's queen side to kind of get some weaknesses and open up the game in some way because we can see the center for now is kind of locked up. So my idea with knight b6 is to target c4, where I also attack the queen on e3 and maybe the pawn on b2. So after knight b6, white went king h1. I really don't like this move at all because now your king is actually much weaker on h1 than it was on g1 because now if a rook or a heavy piece gets to the back rank, it's checkmate, whereas at least on g1 it could have gone to f2. So almost any move besides king h1 would have been better, and the computers suggest queen f2, which just prepares to deal with knight c4 by just getting out the way right away. But king h1, I must say, was a puzzling one. I didn't actually realize why he played king h1 until a few moves down the line. So after king h1, I went knight c4, and then the queen did go back to f2. And now I went for my second probing move, which was the move queen a5. And the idea here was just to eye the a2 pawn and say, are you going to defend it? Are you not? Are you going to make your rook go to a1 and be passive? Are you going to push it and create a weakness? And David decided to play a3 defending this pawn, which is fairly logical. But now I played my third probing move in a row, which was queen b6. And this one I kind of like the best because here not only am I probing the b2 pawn, but I'm also pinning this rook on d4 for the time being. So the point is that if you, sure, the queen on f2 is protected by the knight on d3, but if you play a move like rook f4, for instance, I can trade on f2 and then take on b2, and you could see the whole queen side will collapse. So another kind of probing move to kind of ask white what they're doing. And in this position, white decided to play rook g1. And it was here that I actually realized what white's idea was all along, was that white was actually trying to play g4 now. He kind of recognized that he was passive on the king side and that this thorn pawn was a problem. And he was going to try and activate his rook on the g file, thinking that now that this rook was on g1, that there can be some activity. And I actually had quite a bit of respect for this plan, because it dawned on me that, again, the base of my pawn chain, this f7 pawn, is not well defended, and if it's picked off, e6 will follow, and maybe this knight will come to f4 and cause some problems. So I thought this was actually a really, really clever thing to do. And it meant that I had to act kind of quickly with my probing on the queen side and couldn't just, continue to hold firm forever. And that's why I went for the move knight a5, my fourth probing move in a row. And I think my most important, because now my knight is actually threatening to go to c6, where I'm hitting the rook on d4 and the pawn on e5. And so it appears that white's queenside, one of white's queenside pawns or kingside or central pawn on e5 would collapse. And I think here I started to kind of, be a little bit forceful with my moves, creating threats now. After knight a5, white played rook h4, which I thought was a really, really radical way to rip open the g file. And I actually was thinking here, well, should I take on h4? I mean, it does double his pawns, but I actually thought, you know what, that would be a bad idea, because if I take on h4, maybe this passed h pawn becomes a factor on the h file. And I especially didn't like that this rook on g1 could dart into g7 and all of a sudden be very, very active. So I decided under no circumstances should I take on h4. And because of that, I decided to play queen b5. And my point is by keeping the queens on the board, I also entertained some of these mating ideas, because the king on h1 is relatively weaker than my king on b8. And I'm still kind of probing a little bit. And now the knight on d3 is a target. So after queen b5, white now went rook d1, defending that knight. And I thought this was a victory in some sense, because now the rook had, sort of got away from the g1 square where I was considering invading on g7. And here I went for knight c6. And now my knight is in a really, really good spot where it's eyeing the e5 pawn, which freezes the knight on d3. And it also prevents this rook from swinging over and challenging my queen with rook b4. So I thought, my knight's in a good spot, my rooks are connected, I'm doing pretty well here, and maybe there's a queen b3 move in the future. White now went for rook f4, I think recognizing that maybe now the trade on h4 wouldn't be so great for him, and he decided to pull that rook back. And here I have a winning position, believe it or not, but I did not see the winning move. Now, I think it's another example of me being kind of strung out on a plan that I was trying to orchestrate and not sensing the new opportunity in the position when I got to this moment, because I played the move queen b3, and that was what I was trying to do all along, right? I provoked this a3 weakness. I wheeled my knight around to c6 to target this one, and I thought from b3, now b2 is hanging, the rook on, it's not hanging, but it's a little bit weak. The rook on d1 is hanging, this pawn might be weak, and I'm really getting somewhere. But instead, believe it or not, there was another winning move, or there was another move, and it was winning. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out what that move was. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what the winning move was. It turns out that the move that wins the game, kind of on the spot, is the move d4. And this pawn sacrifice, amazingly, just opens up the world to my pieces and is decisive in all lines. So why is that? Why is this move so strong? Well, the reason for it is because after c takes d4, I actually have the move rook hd8. And the problem here is that my rooks on the d and c file now totally take over, and the d4 pawn is nearly impossible to hold. And so let me show you what I mean by that. After rook hd8, I'm actually now threatening queen b3, which hits the rook on d1 and makes it very difficult to defend. And after queen b3, if you move the queen to defend, the d4 pawn hangs. So for instance, let's say rook h4 to go after my h3 pawn. Well, now I can go queen b3, and this line kind of illustrates the problem, because if you go rook d2, well, first of all, if you go queen e2, I play knight takes d4, and all of a sudden your position is collapsing, the queen is hit, my rooks can invade, my queen is hitting the rook. Yeah, we get that. But if rook d2, it appears that everything is protected except the back rank. And this is the thing that we're talking about with this thorn pawn has become such a problem, because the king is so vitally weak here and tactics crop up. And here there's an amazing move, knight takes e5. And even though the knight can be captured in two ways, neither is adequate. If knight takes e5, I have rook c1 check, and white has to give up the queen just to stave off checkmate. So that's decisive. And if d takes e5, if d takes e5, well, then this knight on d3 is just hanging. So I can go rook takes d3, and now the same threat of rook c1 is in the cards, and is just pretty much unstoppable. So because of that, d4 cannot actually be captured, and the position is just pretty much won. Now, let's say a move like b4 is played to stop the queen b3 idea that we mentioned before, right? Well, now I can actually play the move queen d5, and this illustrates another idea why this d4 move is so strong, because now my queen on d5 is extremely centralized, and knight takes d4 is a serious threat. And the problem is you can't do anything about it, because if you move the knight away to protect the d4 pawn again, I have knight takes e5, and you can see with this pin, the rook on d1 is just hanging. So tactically, there's pretty much no way to stop the inflow of my heavy pieces on the d and c files after d4, and that coupled with this thorn pawn on h3 means that the position just cannot be held together. Believe it or not, after d4, the move that the computer wants to make is actually c4. And I think that just kind of illustrates the problem in the position, that white's actually sacrificing a pawn just to close down one of the files. And it's pretty apparent that he's not going to get the pawn on d4 back anytime soon, because my knight on c6 is well covering it. So yeah, a little bit of a missed opportunity there. But black is still better after my move queen b3. So after queen b3, white actually went queen e2, protecting this rook. And believe it or not, I have another opportunity to play this super strong move d4. And I don't do it because I didn't see the idea, frankly. And here it's not as strong as the other variation, but here after d4, white has knight c5. And again, I can go queen d5. And I just have a fabulous position here with the queen on d5. Well, if c takes d4 is played, again, I can go rook hd8. And now knight takes e5 is a threat, as in the other lines. And it's just a huge advantage to black. So unfortunately, I didn't see this d4 idea again, and instead I went for the move queen b6. And it's kind of funny because my idea with queen b6 was actually to tease the d4 move, because now the pawn was actually protected twice. So I thought that now it's like a serious threat, but of course I could have just done it right away. After queen b6, white went for b4, trying to, take back some of the space on the queen side that was lost when my queen was kind of invading on the b3 square. And this move is interesting, but the problem is that it creates some weaknesses. Namely, the c4 square and the a4 square, and the c3 pawn and the a3 pawn, right? Because you push that pawn, you create those weaknesses. And so I thought now the c3 pawn is going to be really tough to defend, and really the only way you can meaningfully do it is by blocking the c file with knight c5. And I thought that couldn't be a permanent outpost for the knight because I could eventually challenge it with b6. So I kind of envisioned here that white was going to try to play knight c5 and that I would need to try and evict that knight. So I pretty much now set about that course to make that happen. And I first start with the move knight e7. The idea with knight e7 was just to attack the c3 pawn right away, make sure that c4 wasn't a move that I'd encourage because now I'm actually threatening to take. And when I do take on c4, my knight has this lovely outpost on d5. So I thought that that was the way to go now. And black now went for knight c5 as I expected, kind of clogging the c file for the moment. And I just went for the move queen c6. Getting this queen out of the way of this nasty family fork that was going to happen on d7, and also lining up another piece on the c3 pawn, which I thought would be a target. Now white actually went c4, and I thought, okay, like he's trying to get rid of his weakness, but again, if my pawn on d5 is gone and my knight gets that outpost, I thought I'd have a really lovely knight there. Not to mention the fact that in some lines, maybe my queen would be well served on this diagonal because, this f3 pawn would be a little bit weak. And, again, this king is in the corner, so they're mating ideas. So I thought I was much better here and felt very optimistic about my position. And I set about to sort of evict this knight from c5. And so I actually decided here to go king a8. And I really like this move because it's just a nice bit of prophylaxis before I played b6. So clearly if I played b6, I thought knight a6 check was going to be played. And so the point is why allow that and with tempo? Because if I go b6, knight a6 is tempo, the king moves, and then b5 comes with tempo. And this is just not something I need to allow. So I thought, if I don't allow it with tempo, he probably is not going to go there because I could just take on c4 next. So after king a8, white actually went rook c1, trying to reinforce the pawn on the c file and already prepare for d takes c4 and rook takes c4. But I saw a fatal flaw with this move on rook c1. And why don't you pause the video and try to figure out what I played here. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to figure it out. It wasn't anything super crazy, and it was consistent with what I was doing and planning to do, and it was the move b6. But I think the critical question is, what do you do if white moves the knight to a6, right? Because that was what we were talking about before, this knight a6 move being a problem. Now I'm not actually winning the c4 pawn because it's well protected. So the question is what to do after knight a6. And the answer to that is after knight a6, I actually have this amazing move which I saw. By the way, this knight a6 move was not played because I think my opponent saw it too. And the move was queen b5. And this was a move I was ready and excited to play. I did not get to do it, but I was thinking about it. And the reason this is so funny is because white has this back rank problem. C takes b5 is not possible because a rook takes c1 and then mate on the very next move. And if you don't take my queen, well, this knight on a6 is just trapped. So it's pretty amazing because it has, it looks like a board full of pieces. It shouldn't be, kind of gone like that, but it is. And the only thing you could do is go back to c5. And here I wouldn't take on c5 now because, he could play b takes c5 and, this is a position that's viable for white. Instead, I would play d takes c4 now. And on the very next move, just take the knight on c5. And again, even in this position, the knight doesn't have really any meaningful squares to go to because they're almost all hanging. And so the only way you can actually save the knight would be knight b3 because now, it looks like I can't take because my queen is pinned. But guess what? I can take. Even in this position, after c takes b3, I can still take the knight because of the back rank problems. And after rook takes c8, it doesn't solve them. This is still a problematic position. And so it's just an amazing, amazing move that because of these back rank problems, I have queen b5. And so after b6, my opponent thought for a little while and wound up playing knight b3. And I think he actually realized the knight was going to be trapped after knight a6. But the problem is here that there are still some back rank problems that exist. And I tried to set out to exploit them by playing the move queen a4. And the reason this move is so strong is because if the knight moves, it's no longer supporting the c1 rook. And not to mention the fact that the a3 pawn is also targeted. So now my rooks are going to be flooding into the game, and my queen is also quite active, attacking things, and the position is lost. White now went queen b2, and I decided to go knight g6. I could have started with d takes c4, but I thought knight g6 was a nice finesse because it just attacks the rook with tempo, and also considers taking on e5 at some moment, because the only square the rook can go to here is d4, and it blocks the protection of the pawn from the queen. But in this position, I first wanted to open up the game a little bit more to try and get at the back rank. And so I decided to play I played knight takes e5, and I was going to, take on c4 on the very next move. But I thought here, winning this pawn is pretty important. f3 is also hanging now. And, yeah, we'd made the time control, and the position is just lost. And, again, the huge thing here is the king on h1 is just so weak because of this thorn pawn. Note, by the way, that, c takes d5 was played, but, white is really tied up. The queen is covering the knight. The rook is also trying to guard this pawn. This rook is trying to guard this pawn. Just everything is so loose in white's camp. After c takes d5, I played rook takes c1 first. The point is that if queen takes c1, the knight is hanging. So you pretty much have to play knight takes c1. And now it's kind of a critical moment because you could see that there's a lot of loose pieces in white's position and a very weak king on h1. And the question is how to proceed here cleanly, how to win this game cleanly right now. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure that out. All right, hopefully you got a chance to figure that out. I started with the move rook c8. Very strong move. The point is that I'm eyeing the c1 knight, so this queen on b2 is tied to that knight because, again, there are these checkmating ideas on the back rank, and I'm not really trying to recapture this pawn on the d file because it's not really going anywhere. So I needn't concern myself with it. And one of the main ideas is actually if this pawn pushes to d6, now I can actually play the retreat queen c6, and this double attack on f3 and c1 would secure the game. So instead, after rook c8, white decided to move the knight and play knight b3, which does cover the c1 knight, still protect it on b3, and it stops my queen on this diagonal for now. But now I can play the move knight takes f3. And here, I managed to get up a pawn again, right? I'm now up a pawn, and this is a huge monster knight on f3 because now this king on h1 can't move, and I just, again, I'm revving up for a piece to get to the back rank. So let's say white does something, relatively tame. Basically my threat in this position is to just try to get a queen in there or a rook in there, and it's just mate. So after knight takes e3, rook d3 was played, and here I played the move queen b5, and this was the decisive move, it was a decisive position, but I think this one really signaled that the position was over because the next sequence is forced. Note that I'm attacking the rook on d3, and you pretty much have to take this knight because you can't allow the queen to get to f1. So after rook takes f3, now I played the move queen takes d5, and this was my idea is I only have 2 pawns for the piece, but this pin is decisive. The pin, coupled with the back rank issues, meant that there are just too many threats here. And I'm immediately threatening queen takes f3 and queen d1. So the only way to deal with both of those threats is the move queen f2. Well, you can also try the move knight d2, but the problem with that is I can go rook d8. And the issue is now this knight on d2 is just hanging, and you can't defend it again because you're pinned. So you pretty much have to get out the pin. And I'm happy to trade to an endgame because a rook endgame 2 pawns up is easily winning. So this would be, very, very easy matter of technique. And so yeah, so knight d2, rook d8, and so white decided to play queen f2 to protect the rook on f3 and defend against queen d1 check, because now if queen d1, there would be queen f1. But instead, of course, I decide to add more pressure to the rook on f3 and the knight on b3, and I played the move rook c3. And the problem here is that you can't defend both pieces. So if you try to defend both pieces with the move knight d2, now I just have the simple move rook d3. And the knight on d2 can't stay on this square, and if it moves, the rook on f3 is hanging. So in the position after rook c3, David actually resigned. This was a fun game to play, just because, I've never actually played this particular line of the exchange Caro-Kann, and in fact, again, we had a completely new position on move 7 that had never been played in the database. So this g6 and bishop h6 plan is incredibly unique, and it actually turned out to be pretty good too. So it's not even like a bad idea, and I'm optimistic that I might be able to employ it in the future. But beyond the opening, we just got a very unique position with castling on opposite sides and dynamic play, but also positional play, which I'm good at. I was just able to kind of slowly outplay him by taking control of important squares on the queen side. And I think the really critical moment were those probing moves I made to kind of provoke some weaknesses, with my queen darting over, provoking a3, and then shifting back to the center. That kind of really helped me in this one. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.